You're listening to This Week in Cardiology from theheart.org on Medscape.
Hi, everyone. This is John Mandrola from theheart.org, Medscape Cardiology, and this is This Week in Cardiology for March 15th, 2019. This week, obesity paradox, not ischemia trial, the MIitraClip, and an ACC preview. First up is a study on obesity and stroke survival. Now, here we go again. Another retrospective analysis reporting an association of obesity and better survival, in this case after stroke. This was an abstract presented at the American Academy of Neurology, where researchers analyzed data from an NIH registry of the FAST-MAG trial. This was a study looking at pre-hospital magnesium in stroke. The trial was negative, but when the researchers looked back at the data and they used BMI as a continuous variable, the risk of death declined linearly with higher BMI. So obesity, paradoxically, looked protective. Now, the authors propose as a mechanism that if a person is overweight or obese, he or she might have more nutritional reserve compared with those who are underweight. And smartly and thankfully, our journalist who wrote the story included a quote from a professor of medicine who stated that obesity does not have some sort of protective effect and that there are no direct clinical implications of these findings. Now, thank goodness, this, my friends, is not a real effect. It is classic collider bias, a form of selection bias. And the best example of this comes from a paper by Dr. Steven Stovitz and colleagues, and it's published in the Journal of Epidemiology and Community Health. And I will link to it in the show notes. These authors were fed up with the many paradox studies, so they did a bit of a parody study. They hypothesized that obese subjects, kids, would have lower rates of diabetes than non-obese subjects due to selection bias, and this finding would make obesity look protective for diabetes, which of course is silly. So they did a real chart review study of thousands of youths at the University of Minnesota who had A1C levels drawn over a 6-year period. Indeed, they found that healthy weight was associated with a 4 to 13 times higher relative risk of diabetes compared with being obese, and the p-value of their study was huge too. And they explained the problem is that the study only included those who had an A1C measured. And think about it. Clinicians draw A1Cs for various reasons, and one is surely obesity, but another is if the child appears ill, like thirsty or super thin, etc. And so that unmeasured confounder, appearing ill, distorts the relationship between obesity and diabetes because those who appear ill and have an A1C drawn will be much more likely to have diabetes. So now back to the original obesity and stroke study. Remember, this was an RCT that compared MAG versus no MAG. Patients were not randomized to obesity or non-obesity. So you could never attribute cause and effect here, and if you can't do that, why do this study? So my friends, when you see paradox studies, the studies that look like obesity protects against AFib, or obesity associates with better survival and heart failure, or even maternal smoking is protective for low birth weight babies, think about collider bias. Second topic, ischemia trial. Social media has changed the landscape of translation of medical evidence. No better example exists than discussion concerning the ischemia trial. Here, the ischemia RCT is comparing OMT, optimal medical therapy, versus OMT plus PCI in patients with stable coronary disease who have documented, all of them, documented ischemia. This trial is not yet published, and yet a robust conversation proceeds on social media. And in 2018, even, this conversation sparked critical editorials and authors' responses in journals. And again, the trial is not yet published. So this week, ischemia authors, noting the changed landscape, took the unusual step in publishing baseline data. PI Dr. Judith Hochman explained that this was so that the community could understand the population that was randomized in the trial. JAMA Cardiology published this report. Now, some specifics. Ischemia randomized about 5,200 patients. They used blinded coronary CTA in most participants and was reviewed by a core laboratory, and this was to exclude left main stenoses of at least 50%, or also to exclude no obstructive coronary disease. The median age of these patients in ischemia was 64 years, and baseline OMT was quite good. Another important specific was that stress imaging was used as the qualifying ischemic test in 75% of patients. But to boost enrollment, the trial allowed entry based only on an ECG stress. So Dr. Raymond Gibbons from the Mayo Clinic, who wrote an editorial in JAMA Cardiology, points out that is a serious concern is the number of patients who were randomized with less than moderate ischemia on stress imaging or less than severe ischemia on exercise ECG. This is important because these patients would be expected to have lower heart event rates, and that will reduce the power of ischemia to detect the benefit of revascularization. So he writes that if the primary endpoint of ischemia is negative, and particularly if event rates are low in both the randomized groups, then some may criticize the trial for not enrolling, quote, the right patients. And if this occurs, he would suggest an alternative explanation, and that is the results are not a failure of ischemia, but rather a success of OMT when it is consistently delivered. The ischemia trial will be a major trial when the results are released. Third topic is yesterday, March 14th, the FDA approved a new indication for percutaneous valve repair with the MIitraClip device in patients with secondary MR. Dr. Bram D. Zuckerman, who is from FDA, said that expanding the approval of this device to heart failure patients who have significant secondary MR, who have failed to get symptom relief from other therapy, provides an important new treatment option. And of course, this is based on the COAP trial results. But that is tricky because MIitraFR was negative. And on paper, the patients in the two trials looked quite similar. And that is why Dr. Zuckerman added this, quote, careful evaluation by a team of specialists is essential to determining whether a particular patient is an appropriate candidate for this procedure. Oh boy, I am worried here about overuse, and I suspect that CMS will put stringent criteria on selecting patients for this device. Now for an ACC preview. First up, of course, is the Apple Heart Study. And Apple's entree into health will steal the show on ACC's first day. The Apple Heart Study includes more than 400,000 participants, but no control arm. It will have two co-primary endpoints. The first is simply the detection of AFib of 30 seconds, detected on a patch ECG after notification of an irregular pulse tachogram. The second primary endpoint looks into the positive predictive value of the irregular tachogram from the watch, and that is it'll be simultaneous ECG detected AFib at the time of the irregular pulse tachogram. Now, the big thing to keep in mind is that these endpoints will be assessed not in the 400,000 strong patient trial, but only in a subset of those older than age 65, which will surely be a small subset. 6 big names in cardiology will assess the study when it is presented on Saturday. And mainstream media will be all over it. Headlines will surely be overreaching. Now, here are a few big questions that Dr. Paul Dorian, a preeminent academic cardiologist from the University of Toronto, raised to me in an email. He said that amongst all the people, note the word people, these are not yet patients, are diagnosed with AFib, how many will have actionable AFib? That is, AFib that requires therapy. Now, I saw a patient recently who had really no significant symptoms, but had had an ECG patch electrode, and this electrode found 15 minutes of atrial fibrillation that was asymptomatic. 15 minutes of AFib once in 14 days. No symptoms, no risk factors. And the patient was already on oral anticoagulants, paying big dollars for the oral anticoagulants, and was on a beta blocker. And all this for a few palpitations that didn't even correlate with the AFib. So how many of these watch-detected, watch-diagnosed patients will become symptomatic once given the diagnosis? And Dr. Dorian's second question, what will be the cost, not just in dollar terms, but in generating worry and anxiety? And then what will be the cost of the downstream testing? Now, it would be true that many patients with watch-detected AFib will be convinced, either overtly or covertly, that AFib is dangerous and they should contemplate therapy, including AF ablation, which is scary because AF ablation has risks, significant risks, especially when one looks at real-world data that is often done by low-volume operators. Now, the second big groups of studies that are coming from ACC include TAVR in lower surgical risk patients with AS. And my friends, I predict this ACC meeting will usher in a new era in cardiology. The PARTNER 3, which is Edwards SAPIEN 3 and Evolut Medtronic self-expanding valves, will test TAVR versus SAVR in patients at low risk of surgery. This is big because in the U.S., TAVR has been used only in moderate to severe surgical risk patients. Going to lower risk patients is also huge because most aortic valve replacements are done in lower risk people. And PARTNER 3 is especially likely to be positive because they included rehospitalization in the primary endpoint along with death and stroke, and of course more surgical patients will be rehospitalized. Evolut is a 2-year trial that's reporting 1-year results, and they're going to impute results to 2 years. Now, why they're not waiting for the 2-year data, I'm not sure. But at least the Evolut trial has a more legitimate endpoint of death and stroke. Of course, the elephant in the room here is that when you treat younger, lower-risk patients, valve durability is an important issue. 1 or 2 year results, therefore, are inadequate, but that issue is unlikely to stop the momentum if these trials are positive. And if I am right, and these trials show TAVR non-inferiority or superiority, cardiology will be changed forever. For instance, right now, to get a TAVR approved, you have to have 2 surgeons sign off on the surgical risk. That requirement will surely change if surgical risk becomes a non-issue. And I suspect regulators and payers will require decision support tools, which I think will be key because framing of this decision will depend a lot on the bias of the clinician. Surgeons will, of course, favor SAVR because of the uncertainties of valve durability with the transcatheter valve. And cardiologists, of course, will point to favorable data if it is favorable, and they will downplay the durability issue. Or, if they're talking durability, they might point to the less than strong evidence of durability from the other studies, mostly observational. Of course, if we get a surprise and SAVR is superior, well, that would maintain the status quo. As I said in my preview column, Apple will get the oodles of press, but these 2 trials, these TAVR trials, are the landmark studies of an era. The third trial presented at ACC that may have a large impact on electrophysiology is called the RAPID trial. My friend and super nice guy, Dr. Khaldoun Tarakia from Cleveland Clinic, will present results of the 7,000 patient strong RAPID trial. And this will study the Medtronic TYRX envelope for the prevention of cardiac device infections. This is a big topic because gazillions of patients have device surgeries and device implants. And the most feared complication is infection. Because, of course, bacteremia with the presence of intravascular leads is a disaster. The TYRX pouch is expensive, but if it reduces infection, it could prove cost-effective. But the trial has its work cut out for it because device infection is not a frequent event. And to the credit of Medtronic and the authors, they chose a legitimate endpoint, which is major infection, period. There are no rehospitalization endpoints in this study. Of course, there'll be many, many more studies at ACC, which begins this Saturday in New Orleans. Our Steve Stiles has a comprehensive review of all the late-breaking trials, and it's a really, really good column. I'd take a look at it. I have a more opinionated and selective review, and the Heart.org Medscape Cardiology will have a full squad of news and features writers covering the meeting. You can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and of course on the website. I'll see you in New Orleans, and that's it for this week in cardiology. Of course, I'm grateful that you listen, and remember, if you like this podcast, please consider subscribing, giving us a review as it helps other people find us.
Will you be attending the ACC annual meeting this weekend in New Orleans? Stop by the Medscape booth and mention Dr. Mandrola's podcast to receive a special thank you gift from Medscape. Remember, visit the Medscape booth number 1911. We'll see you there.
You're listening to This Week in Cardiology from the Heart.org on Medscape.